I just got the alert on my phone that we're going live, so. Okay, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started for this evening. A little more about that in just a minute once we actually get started, but I'd like to first open in prayer and then we'll move forward. So let's pray together. Father, we thank you first for bringing us here tonight. Thank you for this opportunity as a church to have important conversations about how we steward our resources and what it means for us to participate in the life of our denomination. We need a great deal of wisdom, and you promise us in your word that if anyone needs wisdom, we need only ask. And so we are asking for you to guide and direct our conversation this evening and continue to direct our church in these matters as well. We ask for your insight. We ask for your presence here tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. The plan for tonight is really 4 parts. There'll be first a couple of words of introduction in terms of how we got to this point. What is it that precipitated these conversations? So it'll be some background information. A few of you will be familiar with that. Some of you maybe not, so we'll try to explain that. Second, I want to just share some of the results of a survey that we did on ministry shares and kind of what that showed about where we're at as a church in terms of understanding what they are and how they're used and what maybe we ought to do next. And then I'm hoping to get into some underlying issues, some of the bigger factors that are at play, because these are, on one level, these are issues about how do we support full ministry shares or not, but on another level, there are other issues in play that we need to be paying attention to. And then after that, there'll be time for questions and discussion. But I do want to emphasize that if you have questions at any point, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. The one thing that you will need to do, or that we'll ask you to do, is to use that microphone. And I know that can feel like kind of a daunting walk, especially because you're all sitting so far back, but then to come all the way forward. The reason we're asking you to do that is because we are live streaming this and we are recording it. And so that, if you speak into that microphone, that will make sure that your question is properly heard and recorded by our live stream. Okay, part 1. Why are we having these conversations? And by conversations, I mean plural. We're having a series of these town hall meetings. We've already had a couple of them on these issues. What precipitated all of this was probably, I think it's been as long as 9 years ago, where we started as a council and as a number of members started to notice increased what we called lobbying on the part of our denominational leadership. So this wasn't just speaking about issues concerning social justice or racism or immigration and so on, but it was actually promoting fairly particular positions on these issues. So it wasn't just saying, for example, we need to find ways to care for the poor. It was saying you need to call your representatives in Congress and ask them to vote for this bill. And that that was about 9 years ago. We started off by presenting a number of overtures to our classis and then in turn to the denomination. And an overture is really just a request that the classis and then from there the denomination take action on something. And we asked them essentially to stop I believe the term we used was the political lobbying. And we spelled out exactly all that we meant by that, but we did that at least 2 times in the last 9 years. And we had varying degrees of success or not, depending on how you measure it, I suppose. But there were repeated, and I should say this too, Sunnyslope was not alone in this. There were quite a number of other churches and classes that shared this concern. And so at Synod, I believe it was in 2018, that was our last overture, and we we asked for an oversight committee, and we asked essentially that they would find a way to, that the Council of Delegates and those in leadership would not take political positions on these issues. And the response that was given was that there would be some committee put in place. That committee was put in place, but it's sort of unclear on exactly how much that committee has done since it was formed. And in the meantime, much of this lobbying has continued, and there are many examples that I could show you, but I won't at this point. So at our last budget meeting, one of the issues that came up was, should we continue to fund ministry shares? Because our ministry shares is a portion of our budget, and it's a fairly significant portion. It's about denominational is about, I think, $36,000 per year. Don't quote me on that, but it's in that neighborhood. That's a fairly large chunk of money that we send off to the denomination each year that then in turn goes to fund many of these ministries. And so the question came up, well, should we continue to fund these agencies if they're being used in ways that are what we considered at the time outside the bounds of what the church should be doing? Well, we adopted the budget last year, you will remember, but we did so with a provision that we would meet again in a town hall style and discuss these issues further before we made a real decision on how much of our ministry shares to pay for the year 2021. In February, we had that meeting, and we had some of those conversations. We have not yet decided exactly how much we need to send in to the denomination to support the ministry shares. We have to still make that decision. We don't make that tonight. Likely, we will make that at our December meeting. The money is there. We just haven't decided how much to send in. The bottom line is, as a congregation, there's been an increasing desire to continue to have these conversations and these discussions to address some of these concerns that we have, and try to look at, as I said a few minutes ago, the underlying issues as well, which I'll get to in a few minutes. So that's kind of what has brought us to this point. We decided in July to have a series of town hall meetings this fall to dig a little deeper into these issues and to allow time for questioning and processing this as a congregation. And so here we are. We'll have one now, and then there's another one that we'll have in October, and they'll kind of piggyback on each other so that we can continue to have this dialogue together as a church. So let me pause there and just ask if there are any questions, and I might punt and tell you, well, I'll get to it in a few minutes, but if it's a question for clarity, I'm happy to answer it. If it's a simple question, just you can stay in your spot, but if it's a more substantive one, come up and use the microphone. Yeah, Pastor John. That's correct. That's correct. Right. So John is pointing out that there has been a change in the way that ministry shares are calculated. And that kind of factors into all of this because so essentially what happened is previously the denomination, they gave a number. They essentially said, here's what our whole budget will look like for every denominational ministry. And that breaks down, and they had a formula for calculating it. But essentially they said to every church, that means you pay $316, or I think it's $348, I think was the last one. Then they changed that system and they said, we're going to ask you churches now to come up with what you would like to pay, and then we'll make our budget accordingly. So they essentially flipped the process around. And so that factors into this as well, because then it's, what this conversation becomes is not, do we pay what they're asking of us, but what do we pay? I mean, so it is a difference. But this year was the switch year because half of this year was still from fiscal year of last year, because the denominational fiscal year starts July 1. So this year is a little bit murky, but going forward, certainly it's a lot simpler in terms of we make a pledge on what we would like to pay. So thanks for the clarification. Are there other questions for clarification? Yes. Thank you. It also makes me feel like I'm not so alone up here.
Ministry shares are. Sorry, now it's on. That slide doesn't actually have the answer to the question, so could,
yes,
for a simple-minded person
yes,
like myself.
Sure thing, thank you. So ministry shares, the simplest way to understand it is it's a commitment that members and churches make to pool our resources so that we can fund ministries like Calvin Seminary, world missions. There's a whole host of things. Some of it's denominational overhead, some of it's like the Office of Abuse Prevention, some of it's the Office of Social Justice, Race Relations, Calvin University. There are, I forget how many, but there's a lot of them. Yeah, if you skip one more slide, you will see that, no, hold on, maybe it's, I didn't put that one up there. If you took the survey, you would have been given a long list of all the possible things that the denomination funds. It's quite a long list. Some of them are very well known, some of them are not. The advantage of doing that, of course, is that ideally it means that churches are able to do a lot more than any one church could do by themselves. In other words, one church would have a hard time sending a missionary and supporting one missionary overseas, to support the entire salary of a missionary overseas. That would be close to $100,000. Well, no church can actually do that, but when you partner together, then it shares the responsibility around. So ministry shares are basically a way that the denomination partners together, and our churches partner together to fund and to support financially a whole host of these ministries. So does that clarify? Okay, thanks. It was a good question.
I have a quick comment, not really a question, but I think
Sure.
I think one of the rationale for transitioning to using a voluntary system for the ministry shares instead of the required amount was that many churches like Sunnyslope contributed the full amount.
Mm-hmm.
But a number of churches didn't contribute anything, or they felt like they couldn't meet the amount requested by the denomination. So instead of giving a partial amount, they actually contributed nothing. And so I think part of the reason for moving to a voluntary system wasn't so that churches like Sunnyslope would now contribute less. It was the idea that the churches that were not previously contributing would actually feel able to contribute in some way financially, even if they were limited and couldn't meet the previous quota.
I think that makes sense. That's a good observation. Now,
I think if they thought that, well, now it's a voluntary system and we're going to get lots and lots less money, I think they would hesitate about doing that. So,
now, incidentally, this is this is still in its very early trial phase of this new system. The amounts are down. I mean, giving is down. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it's hard to tease out any one. So COVID has a big piece to play in that. But giving was declining anyways for some of the reasons that Nathan puts out there. So part of it was an attempt, and this was a few years in the making. It was an effort to say, well, how can we think of this creatively and maybe encourage some churches that were not giving? So, for example, church plants, until they're an officially organized church, don't normally contribute to ministry shares because, this is going to sound bad, but they don't officially have members because they're an unorganized church. And so once they organize, then they have members and then they contribute. But now this is a way of saying to even churches that are unorganized, hey, you can participate in this too, if you're able to contribute. And it also allows people to say, some churches want to tithe off of their budget. If their annual giving is $100,000 or $500,000, then they just tithe off of that. So it allows flexibility rather than simply being told what they have to give. Other questions, comments on ministry shares in general, how we got here? Sure. Previously, right. So, yep. Yes. Yeah, thanks, Jason. The question is, how did they get to the amount of money that is asked of the churches, our church? And there's two answers. The previous way that this was done was all the agencies, World Missions, Calvin University, et cetera, they all submitted a budget. And that budget was then adopted by Synod. And then out of that came the amount that they said, okay, that's going to take this amount per member from each church. Now, I'm simplifying it a little bit because actually there's a formula that was used that said if you have 100 members or less, then you actually can take a reduction. So it's kind of an IRS thing where they have nice complicated forms but they do that so that the burden is lessened on smaller churches. So there's a formula essentially that would get you to that amount. Now, when they switched over, what they do now is they give an amount that is suggested, and they start it on here's what you've paid in the past, and what is supposed to then, and so it'd be for this year especially, it's okay, you've paid this much. What is supposed to happen and what does happen is then each church makes a pledge. And then at classis, there's supposed to be discussion and conversation about the pledges that the churches of classis have made. That's to keep some accountability in the game. That's so that churches can't just say, we're not giving anything, and then no one will know except for some person in Grand Rapids. This is meant to say, so if churches say we're not giving anything, then that's supposed to foster some discussion at the classical level so that churches can say, well, hey, maybe you should rethink that. So that's how they get the amount, and then our church then looks at that, and we make a commitment. Do we want to pay that? Do we want to pay less? Do we want to pay more? So that's. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, because our.
But yeah, so basically what we did is we took that equation, and there's a couple of things that, like Pastor Rob says, based on the size of the church, also based on your geography. So we're a long ways from Grand Rapids, so less of our money goes to Calvin because we have local Christian colleges that we fund around here. So there's also discounts based on geography. So basically what we did is we took that equation from last year, did it up, took kind of an average increase, about 5%, added that onto this year's, and then basically came up with our number that way. Another reason why they switched this year was because budgeting, and like Pastor Rob said before, they would basically come up with their own number of what they needed and said, okay, churches, here you go. That's a very poor way to plan your budget. That's like me going, okay, I want to buy this truck and this house and this, and now I got to go find a job that's going to make that kind of money. No, I have this much money based on what the churches say they're going to give. Now I can build my budget off of that. That's a lot of the reason why they kind of push for this as well.
Thanks, Derek. Any other questions or for clarification? So I want to move then into the survey. We conducted this, I don't know, back April, May, sometime around there, maybe a little earlier too. This was not a scientific survey. This was really not, it was more of an informational, a tool to gain some information. I think we had 22 to 23 people respond. 2/3 of them were longtime Sunnyslope members, and 90% have been a part of the CRC for 6 years or more, which is a way of saying most people who responded are fairly familiar with the Christian Reformed Church and the various pieces of the CRC. We asked the question, what are ministry shares? Because in part I wanted to gauge just our level of familiarity with them overall. And there was quite a range. Most people were at least familiar with the system. Less than half felt either neutral or unfamiliar, but not everyone responded to that question. What was more interesting to me was when, and I think that's on the, no, I'll save that one. What was more interesting to me was just learning which of the various agencies were people familiar with. And some of the ones that were just about everyone knew of, say, Calvin University, Calvin Seminary, Resonate, although Resonate used to have a different name. But then when you get into like the Office of Disability Concerns, the Office of Race Relations, and the Office of Safe Church, those were all organizations that people were a lot less familiar with. So that was just good to see how people are or aren't familiar, because that factors into, what do we do with all of this? What is this money actually used for? And so that was kind of helped us see that. I asked the question on the survey, do you think this, so we pay $331 per person, per adult member per year. And you can go to the next slide, and the question was, in your opinion, is this too much or too little? Well, one was I think 10 was too much, and one was like, fully supporting that amount. So you can see that the range of opinions is pretty well distributed across the spectrum. So, which is important, because it shows that it's not all like, yes, we've got to stop doing this, or yes, this is the greatest thing that we're doing. It was pretty well spread out across the range of opinions on that. So, next slide. The next question we asked supported that idea, because I asked the question, so if we were to lower this, because that's what we're considering doing, we're considering maybe reducing our commitment, what percentage would you consider reducing it? The 26.3% you can see is 0. That says leave it alone. So a quarter of the people say leave it alone. But then from there on out, it's, again, pretty well spread out, with the exception of 15%, which is half, that supported half. So there was a range of opinions. There was no real uniformity on, yes, we've got to either continue to fund this entirely, or yes, we've got to stop it altogether. It was pretty well balanced. So I thought that's relevant, and that's worth paying some attention to. Questions on that? So that's really just kind of some feedback in terms of what we learned. But are there any? Before I go into some of the underlying issues, I want to allow some time for more questions on this, or comments, or if you took the survey. There was quite a bit of written feedback too, which I didn't include here because I didn't want to presume to share people's comments with a wide range of people, but quite a range of comments too, which was instructive and I thought helpful. But if you want to share your own thoughts or observations on this, you're welcome to do so now. Anyone? All right. Then I'm going to take us into part 3, which is underlying issues. And I think this is, in some ways, this is maybe the more significant aspect, because this forces us to ask questions about what does it mean for us to live as a church, be part of a denomination. How do we go forward on this, paying attention not just to a dollar amount on a piece of paper, but to what's really at stake here? I want to emphasize 2 things, at least 2 things, and there may be more. 2 things that are not really the question here. And this is important because as I've had these conversations with other people and people in our denomination, and I hear differing things that come up that make me think that the issue isn't always entirely clear. So first of all, because a good part of this has revolved around some of the work and the advocacy that has been done by one of these agencies, which is called the Office of Social Justice and Hunger Action, they've been the ones that generally, but not exclusively, tend to focus on some of these promoting certain political positions and legislation and so on. And when you oppose that, it can sound to some like what we're saying is the church should not be involved in ministry that addresses social concerns. I was at Synod 3 years ago, and this issue was being discussed, and I forget who was speaking. I was listening. So someone else was talking and saying, we've got these concerns about, advocacy, and someone else kind of just shouted out, hey, the church has to care about justice. And that is, I think, indicative of how this is often misunderstood. As a church, we need to care about issues of justice and racism and poverty and immigration and a whole host of these issues that are facing not just our church, but actually our broader communities and our nation. And these are things that I think the church is called to care about. And as Christians, we need to be deeply concerned for these issues. And just as a little side note, one of the reasons that we've been pursuing some support and partnership with Salem for Refugees is for this exact reason. There was a sense that it's important that we find ways to do this constructively. So Sunnyslope Church has to care about these issues. The gospel is not just about, your spiritual, your soul, and making sure your spirit goes to heaven when you die, and then this world can fall apart, and we don't care about the issues that face our world. That is not the case. We need to care deeply about these sorts of issues. So that's not the issue that is at stake. I want to be very clear on that. The question, whenever we raise critique of, say, something like the Office of Social Justice, it's not because the issues themselves are unimportant. They are important. And related to that, the question is not even whether or not the church should speak to these issues, and even from the pulpit. So, should I preach on racism? Yes. Immigration? Yes. Poverty? Yes. But the question is, so we as Christians have a voice in these issues. We must, right? We speak out of Scripture. We can be God's mouthpieces wherever He has placed you, broader culture. We ought to be a prophetic voice in that sense. And that's really, really important. So right at the outset, I want to be very clear about that. This is not a question of whether or not the church should care about or speak into questions of politics or issues, social issues, and so on. The real question I would suggest to us is not if, but how. So take an issue like, let's take one that's in the news these days, immigration, right? You've seen the news, you've probably paid some attention to what's going on at the border. Should Christians care about this? Yes. Should Christians be involved in working for solutions that are just and equitable and so on? Yes. Are there multiple approaches that have validity? Well, yes. It's really hard to say, thus saith the Lord, vote on legislation X, Y, and Z. And Christians ought to support that particular candidate's approach because these are complex issues. So that's in our judgment where the line has been crossed, is not so much talking about these issues and raising them, but going beyond that to, hey, you need to support this particular approach. So that's I guess the maybe that ties into the underlying issue. We can go to the good. So that's the first thing. The second, then, the underlying issue, the next question is, how does the church effectively use her resources to do ministry? In other words, is this a more should we look for a more centralized approach where the resources are primarily managed by the denominational agency, or is it better to do it on a more local level? And those are two opposite ends, and I'm not saying it's a binary decision. There's, it's a spectrum, I suppose. There's, it need not be one or the other, but the question is, how much and to what extent do we send our money away so that then the other agencies can do that work in our sort of representing us? and how much of it should we focus on doing it in the local community. So this is just purely a hypothetical for the sake of an example. If you want to care about, say, refugee resettlement, is it better to send lots of money to Grand Rapids by way of ministry share so that the Office of Social Justice can advocate and fund a position in Washington, D.C., and advocate for specific positions? That's one approach. Or is it better to keep that money locally and build a partnership with Salem for Refugees so that then the church here, local church, is involved in that work in our community? So do you see the difference there? And so that's the tension that has come up a number of times, or the discussion that's come up repeatedly. What is the best way to manage the resources, and what is our approach to ministry? Is it a more centralized or a more localized approach? And where along the spectrum should that fall? And then related to that is point number 2 up there, which is the tension between the local church and the larger denomination. And I would suggest that this is not just a ministry share question. This has always been an issue, is not in a bad way even, but just the question of, where does a church fit in the larger denomination? What is the purpose of a larger denomination? Why do we belong to a denomination? And these are good questions to ask. So what does it mean to be a part of a denomination? And what's the role of the denomination in the life of the church? What's the role of the church in the life of the denomination? Let me pause there again and ask for questions, comments, discussion. Margie. Okay. Yeah, so the question is, do we know what percentage goes to the Office of Social Justice and Hunger Action? The answer is yes, we do know. And I'm trying to think of that number offhand, and I don't want to be misquoted. It's not a large percentage that goes there. Do you have it there?
Percent.
1.31%. So I believe I calculated the dollar amount at one point, and it was about $3,000. Somewhere around there. Now, that said, the bigger part of this question is also, is this just about one agency, or is it a more broadly seen, is the issue more broadly seen across multiple agencies? And that question has been raised as well. And I've seen some signs that it is more broad than just the one agency, even if the one agency is where we see it and where we started to see it first and primarily. But it's one and a little bit percent. Yeah.
So when considering lowering ministry shares, is the purpose behind that to try to enact change of the denomination and cease the lobbying? Or is it because we simply decide that money is better spent locally than denominationally?
Right. Very good question.
Are we trying to enact change, or do we just have
right.
a choice of where our money's going?
That's an excellent question. My sense is that this is not so much about trying to enact change. Partly because it's not a very effective way of bringing about change. But we have tried to enact the change, and I want to emphasize that. We didn't just say, you know what, we don't like the way they're doing this, we're going to stop. We should think about not paying this anymore. We've tried the proper means of approaching this for 9 years or so, and very little has changed, even though there are these, again, we're not alone in this. There are other churches and other classes that share these concerns. So we've tried to enact the change, but some of the frustration has come from the fact that I'm not always sure we're being heard. So this isn't about, well, fine, then we're going to just, maybe if we take our money, then you'll listen. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's a shift in looking at what is the best use of financial resources. Is it better to do these things on a local level or on a denominational level? And I think there's value. I can put my cards on the table, I think, a little bit. So this is not the totality of what I'm saying, but I think there's value in seeing local ministry and seeing the church get involved in local issues, because these are things that affect our community and therefore that our church ought to be invested in. So, Pastor John.
It seems to me that this is at the heart of the issue, this question that we have up here. Going back to the overtures the last 12 years or whatever it's been, we've made it basically an either-or matter. Either we have to listen to our overtures, which didn't happen, we don't think, very well. The committee wasn't very effective, or now we have to make this major switch. I don't think that should be the choice. I do believe that we can withhold monies from OSJ, or if there is another organization that we think is particularly pushing political motives, because we have it within our system that we can give offerings. We don't have to use ministry shares. So the deacons could set up a program whereby we say, we're going to give, if the whole budget is, let's say, $35,000, we're going to give $5,000 to Resonate, to do world missions and home missions. And that is our offering for that purpose. It's not ministry shares. We're going to give another $3,000 to Calvin College. Of course, we're still going to give another $3,000 to Redeemer, because that's our closer one. Kings. And we're going to give $2,000 for synodical services, because we all do benefit from that. You wouldn't be going to Synod if we didn't have synodical services. That's a thing that we often overlook, that we all benefit from that kind of thing. We have synodical deputies coming to our classes meeting this Saturday. They're paid for by synodical services. And so if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have deputies, unless we were going to pay for it all ourselves as the classes, which would be tough to do sometimes. So I do think that we could make a better study of saying, can we withhold some particular items and do the rest simply by donation, not by ministry shares. We don't have to do ministry shares. We can say to classes, we're not going to give anything to ministry shares this year, because we're going to be giving by way of donations. And that's our prerogative in this new system. Now, I think that's something that we have not explored sufficiently at this point. And the reason I think this is at the heart of the issue is because just to say we're going to cut down 50% of what the sum was last year really says we're going to cut off 50% of all our support for the denomination. Our denomination is the Christian Reformed Church, of which we are a part. We believe, and we have believed so far, that being reformed is part of who we are, and that these various institutions, whether it be chaplaincy at colleges and so forth, is putting out a reform perspective in their work and bringing that to bear. I don't think we can do that as effectively as one church as we can collectively together. I think to cut seriously into ministry share amount and withhold that from the entire denominational work severely impacts, if we really still think we are a Christian Reformed church, are we a part of the Christian Reformed denomination? I know there are other things on the horizon that we may get into at another time, but we're not there yet. We're dealing with
Right.
this right now. So I think that if it's Calvin College that somebody really says, we think they're gone south, we don't agree with that, we could say we're going to not give that percentage. It's very small, basically, because it's for student aid. It's not really to the college per se, it's to student aid. So it's a small amount, but we could say we're going to up our ante for King's and Redeemer because those are reformed colleges, rather than saying we're going to withhold our college money and give it to Corbin. That's a local college and it's Christian, but we want to support it, but it doesn't claim to be reformed. So that's why I think this is such an important issue, the tension between local church, larger denomination. Now, I've lived on the West Coast now for quite a long time and done ministry on the West Coast since 83. You can figure out how long that is. That's by far the majority of my ministry. And I can say, I believe I would be echoed by many of the colleagues around here, is that the West Coast often feels ignored by the denomination. We're almost like we're a stepchild, as it were. And I know there's been some attempts at times to do a little more, but I don't think it's been satisfactory to assist us, nor are we really heard when we raise our voice. Oh, that's those folks out there on the other side of the mountains. We don't pay much attention to them. That's the impression that is often left, like it or not. But I've sensed that pretty strongly in the ministry that I've been a part of in the last about 20 years or more than that even. So I think it's and I think all these other factors come back to that. When we talk about percentages, how many should leave it? 14 or, 1/4, 15%. That's not the issue. The issue is, do we believe that we're a part of a denomination? And is that important?
Go to the next slide.
And if the denomination is erring in some ways that we feel strongly about, we have it within our means to withhold that part of giving altogether, and we can use that part of money locally. We've seen a lot of changes. I'm not totally happy with the way Resonate is now. It mixes up world missions and home missions and everything in the pot, and it's hard to know what you're really giving to. We may say we don't want to give as much for that. We would rather start a work locally, maybe a ministry with Hispanics, that we say we want to have a reformed voice in that ministry in this area. We can do that. So I think that we're better off looking carefully at which things do we want to back off from denominationally, rather than just using a flat percentage, because we can send a clear message, and we can say at the same time, we're not saying we want to pull out of the denomination. We value our denomination, but we have serious concerns, and that's why we're doing things the way we are.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I agree with Pastor John that, yeah, simply cutting 50% of our support for the denomination would send a bad message and really isn't very useful either in enacting any sort of change or whatever you might suggest. But at the same time, I think cherry picking and saying, well, we want to support Resonate and we want to support the services and all the other things, but not OSJ. And so we'll give money to all the other things, but not this one. It's effectively the same thing as cutting off half of support, because now suddenly our church is going to pick and choose what to pay or what to voluntarily support. And all the other churches, the liberal ones in in Grand Rapids, well, they're going to support the OSJ, but maybe not something else, right? And so, it would be no different than if I, as a member of this church, decide, well, I like pastor here, I'll pay his salary, but the church's decision to pay for, I don't know, some of the youth ministries. I don't think that's as important. I only want my tithe to go to pastor, right? And so, picking and choosing the budget, I think, Synod meets and they decide how these, things are formed. We have a forum, Synod, and we have overtures to discuss these issues. And yes, sometimes your overtures are not heard, or maybe you get the decision you don't like. But that's the place to discuss whether or not the OSJ should exist or whether they should lobby or things like that. It's not going to be at this local council level. We're not going to decide here today whether the OSJ should lobby or do political action, because we're not, that's the denomination, that's a Synod issue that needs to be discussed if that needs to be a discussion. So I think simply resorting to cherry picking and choosing what issues to fund in our denomination really doesn't help the situation either. It's going to just split us apart more.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. And Pastor John was talking. I put up the final slide with two more of the underlying issues, which John identified one, and I think, Nathan, you identified the other, which is, what does it mean to be part of a denomination? We have to ask ourselves that question. If you look at reducing, cutting, eliminating altogether, then what does it mean to be part of a Christian Reformed denomination? We have to look at that and ask ourselves that. The other question is, so what about, how do you support or not support agencies with which we disagree? Do you say, well, we can't expect to agree with everything, say, the Banner publishes, but that doesn't mean we necessarily stop funding it, or OSJ? Or does it mean we say, well, we've got concerns that are deep enough and significant enough that we can't in good conscience put that funding towards those causes, and we look for a way to reduce. That's what you have to grapple with. I'm not coming down here one way or the other. I'm just acknowledging that that's, I think, exactly what Nathan is raising. How do you support agencies or not support agencies with which you disagree? Al, you were going to say something.
Just a quick question. So far, we're talking about our church. How much of this is going on through Classes Columbia? How much is this going on through some of the other classes? Are they all looking at the same thing? Or are we standing out here on an island by ourselves? Because the more numbers we have, the better chance we have of making an impact. But one church is not going to make any impact whatsoever.
Correct. As to the underlying issues, some of the stuff that I talked about earlier, there are quite a number of churches that are openly discussing and have openly addressed those concerns. In 2018, when we brought the overture to Synod, there were, I think, two or three other classes, I don't remember, but two or three that brought similar overtures and asked for some similar action. Some of the details were a little different, but in general, so these issues, the underlying issues, the concerns over overstepping authority are pretty widespread. How many churches and classes are talking about reducing funding? I'm less sure on that, except I can say that the amount of income has gone down fairly steadily. I have no idea if that's causation or correlation, and that's a huge question and a very important one that I don't know, because there could be a lot of reasons that funding would decrease. I think I read somewhere that revenue is down something like 15% for this year. That does not mean that lots of churches are having this discussion and reducing their funding. It might mean that's a piece of it. Okay, so I want to be clear on that. We don't know, but that's a theory that has been floated around. So that's a kind of a long way of saying I don't exactly know the answer to the second part of your question. But giving from our church, for the past long number of years in a row, we've paid 100% of our ministry. It's strong, yeah. The issue is not in any way do we need to cut back our expenses in order to make budget. That's not an issue at all. God has been very good and church has been very generous. So that's not really a factor in this.
do
Jason?
have a comment. So I was, again, for those of you who haven't heard, I was a part of the Overture Committee back in 2018, I think you said.
Mhm.
So I've thought about this hopefully longer than most of you. I hope you haven't been burdened with this issue that long. But I find myself constantly checking my heart on this. We've started this as a complaint against OSJ. And when our overtures weren't heard, we have considered over and over again to reduce ministry shares. And now I see that we want to use that money for a local organization, which I support, Salem for Refugees. But when I step back, I think, why don't we just support Salem for Refugees if that's where our heart is? Why do we have to cut back in ministry shares if our heart is for local refugees? And so that, I think that is where I tie in with John, and I'm sorry, you guys are brothers, Nathan, and Matt's points. I think you guys are of the same mind, so I think I can kind of attribute that to both of you. Well, I'm all for supporting more local organizations. I'm not sold on the idea that we need to back away from the denomination. And that's kind of where my heart stands right now after lots of years of wrestling with it.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Jason. John? And we can go to the last slide because that's where we're at. So.
Basically, I agree.
John, can you talk into the microphone so that we pick it up on the...
Basically, I agree with what Nate is saying about the process that we use and that we should normally use. However, we have tried that on a couple of occasions with overtures and so forth, and have not been very effective with it. So this would be a way of saying you have not been faithful in really using this committee in dealing with the issues that we brought up in the overture that we asked you to deal with. And you say we'll put up a committee and that'll fix it, but you haven't fixed it. That's why when I talked about not paying ministry shares, I said let's isolate that issue then. That way, and I think you can call it cherry picking, but it's after a long process, many years of saying, this is happening too often. We want this to be different in the denomination. And what else can we do except to say, well, okay, we'll do nothing. And we'll let it go. So, and if that's our decision, okay, I can live with that. But the reason I would propose what I did before, cherry picking if you want to call it that, is simply because for a long time we have tried to follow procedure and it has not gotten us very far at all. I would see zeroing in on OSJ, not so much as cherry picking, but as a way of saying we want to preserve the remainder because we are a part of a denomination. And so we're not trying to opt out of that. Does that make some sense, what I'm trying to say? I mean, you may not agree with it, but you understand what I'm trying to say. So that's what I was trying to get across there.
John, a little closer to the mic. Sorry, it's just...
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess you're I don't know if you're getting back to the matter of if we don't, well, we don't pay ministry shares, okay? We're done with ministry shares, as it were. If we decide to go to classes this year and say, we're only going to pay 75% of what we paid last year through the denomination. As I understand it, that's within our rights to do. We can do that. And if we give as our reason because we believe we want to support several local ministry shares, instead, I think that's legitimate according to the new system that's been in place. Remember, you may not know this, but when you pay 100% ministry shares like we have been doing for the last, how many years?
For a very long time.
You really probably have been paying about 125% because the average is about 65%, or maybe it's even lower than that now. So, in fact, we have been really giving more than our share of ministry shares by giving 100%. Does that make sense? Okay. When I was on the board of trustees years ago, that was already a big issue back then. The churches that are paying 100% are really paying 125%. So if we decide we're going to pay 25% less because we're using that now locally, I think that's a legitimate way of approaching it without saying we're going to not give anything to the denomination because we have that choice now. If we go that direction, I guess I have a couple of questions. You can take them now or later, but I prefer to just say them now while I'm here anyway. What are the parameters that we're going to have for deciding what else we want to use those funds for? Is it reformed? Okay, we're going to give money to, I'll use Corbin College because it's local. Is it reformed? If it's not, is that where we want to give our money rather than to another reformed college, an alternate that we have? Those are the concepts. So what are the parameters? How do we make those decisions? And once we make those decisions, because I presume that eventually if we go that direction, the council is going to come with some recommendations. Those I take it will be voted on at the congregational meeting because that's where we vote on our budget items. And they will be reviewed annually again at the congregational meeting for their vote. So I'm presuming that, but I haven't seen that. But those are the two things that
let me just quick speak to that because the answer is we haven't even gotten that far yet. And so
you're right. You're right. And I'm just saying if
so,
we go
but
that,
yes,
if we go that direction, I'm saying there are two things that I think
that would
council
be
has to really think about. What are the parameters?
right.
And making sure that it comes back to the congregation for
Right.
vote. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I only interject because I want to make it clear that we haven't even set on any course of action yet. That's why these meetings, just to hear and listen and exchange and discuss ideas. So yes, I mean, were we to go in a direction like that, that had been talked about informally in council meetings, the idea had been discussed about, well, do we just take offerings for individual causes or what? Those ideas, at this point, everything is on the table. And I think that would be one of the things that we would have to certainly look at is reformed and then bringing it to the congregation. Margie, I think your hand was up. Okay, I can repeat it. Yeah, right. The question is the Office of Social Justice, do they do any good things? And I want to be clear, we're not trying to present this as a forum on the OSJHA, all right? And I know you're not saying that, but I just want to be clear that we're not trying to do because they, in fact, we've had them out here some years back to do a conversation and lead a sort of a workshop thing. That's probably been 5 or 6 years or longer ago. But they facilitated those sorts of conversations. So, well, they have conversations in local churches that are meant to spark discussions on issues concerning justice and from a faith point of view. I think, my personal opinion is that I think there could be a very valuable role for the Office of Social Justice to play if it were to encourage conversations and discussions and provide resources to think through issues of justice from a biblical standpoint. I think that would be a very valuable thing that they could do. Unfortunately, my own opinion is that much of their work has been eclipsed by promoting particular advocacy on lots of issues. So short answer to your question is yes, I think they do good things, but yeah, and it's not just about the OSJ either. I want to be very clear about that. Jason, that you're here suggests that you probably had another question or
Sure.
comment.
I'm just going to stay down here because the mics aren't changing. And I don't want to hog the mic either. Just to your point, one of the classes that I was at, I believe OSJ was advocating for churches to provide more services for like disabled people and to make them aware so that they show up on the national CRC website. So that's like access ramps, like headsets so you can hear, teletype type
I think
things.
though
those
that
kind
was
of-
the Office of Disability Concerns.
Oh, okay, maybe wrong.
But
okay,
you know what? That's a good example of
but
one of these other agencies is not as well known that does encourage
sure.
good things.
Okay.
And that, to me, that's the kind of thing that something like the OSJ could do is, here are some of the issues and, you know, how can churches think through that without saying, therefore, you must take this particular course of action. So,
And then, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to ask: is classes this weekend?
yes, it is. It's on Saturday.
Can you just survey the room and see where people are going on ministry shares? If you think more people are contributing or more people are cutting back, or maybe you already know that.
I don't know that already. It's a virtual classes,
Oh, okay.
which makes it a little harder to do a survey in some ways. But I would have to check my agenda to see if and where that discussion is slated to happen. I don't have it from me. John, do you know? Okay. 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 So it's to, got it. Okay.
And then one last question. This is more for the room. We're considering reducing shares, ministry shares, or our contribution to the denomination. Are there any other reasons or concerns outside of the OSJ issue that we've discussed extensively and said is worth about $3,000 of our money, approximately?
I think that would depend on who you talk to. I think the short answer is I can say yes. I've heard other concerns outside of the OSJ.
I guess I intended that to the town hall. If
yeah.
Maybe you could
That's
forward your
good.
concerns. Or
That's a good way to go. If anyone wants to weigh in on that, Doug.
Are you coming at 7:30? I was digging a hole for a gas line. So this is what I was digging it in. So I think first, I've been here for, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. One of the things that I kept hearing is ministry shares, ministry shares, ministry shares. We're kind of stuck on that label. Ministry shares, as we have known them, are no more. So when we say reduce ministry shares, that's actually not an accurate way of expressing it. The denomination has realized that there is a push to localizing, that its ministry shares is a bit of a failing program anyway, because there's so many churches who protest by not paying their ministry shares, or simply disagree with what's going on in Grand Rapids and so reduce their ministry shares. So instead of continuing a system that's sort of ignored by many, they said, okay, really no more ministry shares. That is, no more so many dollars per family or so many dollars per member. They said, tell us what you want to give us, and then we'll budget from there. There is a trend nationally within the CRC to localize. Once upon a time when missionaries got sent out, guess who paid them? The denomination. They don't anymore. Who pays them? Churches like us. We commit to certain missionaries and we pay them. That's been localizing for a long time now. This is just another step in localizing. So if you think that what we're doing is we're rebelling against the denomination by reducing what they're saying we have to pay, that is completely wrong. We are not. We're simply allocating what it is that we're deciding to send to Grand Rapids so that a bureaucracy there, and it's not synod, that a bureaucracy staff mostly with people in Grand Rapids who have a tendency to have a political perspective that kind of colors everything that they do. Shall we send our money there, or are we better off doing other things? It could be local, it could be regional, it could be international. We already send people. Where are all the places you've gone?
I think we're up to 5.
Okay,
10.
we have a fund that sends people to go teach things other places. Shoot, I wish the denomination would do that kind of stuff, but they don't. And it's not just us. Northwest Iowa, for example, is very much at odds with the general posture of the denomination. You know what they do? They do have their own local programs that they do, including programs that they go to other countries and do things. The question is, how do we best steward our money? And we're not under a mandate. Point 2, most churches like us, PCA, RCA, a lot of churches like us, I think we are the exception to the rule of they require a denominational contribution to run the denomination. That's it. Everything else is free will. What do I mean when I say run the denomination? Well, you got to pay for people to come to synod. You have to pay for certain administrative staff that supports people going to synod. In other words, it's the machinery of the ecclesiastical organization. Our church order still says that we are an ecclesiastical organization. We have expanded that mandate quite a bit into doing other things. If you would go back 30 years, no one would imagine having an office of social justice, let alone lobby every year about the ag bills that come up. There are so many things that we do now that we would not have imagined then. Remember back to the God Hour? I used to do a Sunday school class. On the door it said, "Think Christian." That was a denominational resource. I don't use it anymore. The reason I don't use it anymore, and this is, by the way, is part of the Back to God Hour, is all they cover anymore is pop music and video games, and I'm not exaggerating. There's no content there anymore to cover. So we're not abandoning some sort of ministry share program. We're simply not. We have been given, as have all churches in the CRC, now the power, the license, the permission to decide what we want to give. And I think within deacons, certainly within my own mind, I would much rather, as a church, decide where to give our budget dollars that are now going to the denomination and decide elsewhere. I think we will get so much more done and so much more stuff that we agree with. Get done. I mean, I follow the denomination quite closely. When you ask the question, does OSJ do anything good? Yeah, I would say 10%, honestly. And I get all of their bulletins, all of their email things, everything that comes through. I read them. They have a site. They have multiple sites. I'm banned from commenting on their Facebook site. They have become substantially identical to the left side of the Democratic Party. And I am not exaggerating. Many of them will do the he, she, whatever programs. They're very woke. They're very left of center in all kinds of ways. Is that a bad thing to be left of center? We probably have people here who may be left of center. That's fine. That's fine. Be left of center. But when our pastor gets up on the pulpit, he should not be spouting left of center things politically. By the way, I don't want OSJ to turn around and be right of center either. Just stay out of it. And what OSJ does has so much infiltrated the other agencies. In fact, there's a job description now for the new director of OSJ, the new executive director. One part of the job description in writing is that its job is to make sure that the other agencies of the Christian Reformed Church are aligned with OSJ's perspectives. And it's happened. That's why now we had a statement signed by all of the agency heads, I think with the exception of maybe one, saying what we should do in response the George Floyd thing. And one of them was, they suggested literally to join your local BLM office. What? If somebody wants to join the BLM office, that's fine. I don't. There's a lot of reasons. I follow it. I know about it. I read books about it. If somebody wants to, fine. It should not be the denomination that is pushing that. There is enough to do within the church world for us not to be doing this with our denominational dollars. But by the way, we don't have ministry shares anymore. So we're not even mounting a protest when we decide to give them less.
Thanks, Doug. Other comments? We have about 10 minutes until our stated end time, so I want to be respectful of people's time, but 10 more minutes. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Just two quick comments. So, while it's true that, yes, the ministry shares, in some sense, do get sent to Grand Rapids, it's also not true that we're just simply 100% of ministry shares go to supporting staff and other people living in Grand Rapids. It's actually only about 20%, okay? 80% of the money goes towards program funding, which is used for whatever that agency is actually doing. Only 20% of the money is the ministry shares goes to paying salaries and staff people in Grand Rapids. So yes, you can argue about what they might be doing, but that's I guess another topic. Yeah, I just want to make that clarification that we're not, ministry shares simply aren't just, that's money going to paying people salaries in Grand Rapids.
Correct. Yeah, no, that's right. Other comments?
I guess I would just state my appreciation for the thoughtful consideration we're giving for this issue, because I think the heart of the matter is, what is the most return on an investment positive thing that we could be doing with the resources that we have? And the arguments in favor of ministry shares is that all the churches are pooling things together to then fund things that one church could not. And I would suggest that if we are moving more towards localized, which is also positive, just having that, kind of echoing that, we need to have some sort of plan for what we're going to do to have that ROI be equivalent to what we could do with ministry shares.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. That's right. This is not about let's save money so we don't have to send it away to some faceless bureaucracy. This is really a question of stewardship. What is the best way to use the resources God has entrusted us to accomplish and to do what God calls his people to do? And that has layers to it. How do we play a part in our denomination, local, more denominational, more broadly? And that's why we're having these conversations, is to try to tease this out. And that's why we're not making a decision tonight, because we've got to wrestle with this a bit and see where it goes. Yeah, Derek.
So I'll be pretty open and honest. When I first heard about this a year and a half, well, I guess it was right almost 2 years ago now, that when I first became a deacon, I was very against reducing ministry shares. I grew up in a Christian Reformed church. I have gone to a Christian Reformed church since I was born. And so when I first thought of it, I was like, oh, no, we can't do that. That's just what you do. The more I've researched, the more I've looked into it, the more I've dug into this, I think really the question we need to ask is, with the new model, what percentage, and it's not even a percentage, what are we willing to contribute to the larger denomination? So if there are portions of the denomination that we as a church do not support what they are doing. And I'm not just saying one portion of that OSJ, 'cause I think there's a larger portion of that. So if there are portions that we disagree with, we should cherry pick those and not support those. That's very much like people that want to use our building. We are not going to let just anybody come in here and use our building if they have extreme differing beliefs or if they have extreme differing viewpoints. Now, that's not going to say we're going to turn them away and we're not going to support them, but there is a call and there is a responsibility as a church to look at where our funds are going and to use those honorably and as God would call us to. And so if the CRC, who we belong to, and I am proud to belong to that, we drove from Eugene here when we lived in Eugene because there was no CRC church, and we looked around. There was no other churches that we really felt strongly that we wanted to be a part of. So the CRC is very much part of me, but I also believe we need to look at what the CRC is doing, and are there portions of it that we need to push back on harder than a letter that got no response. And so if funding, because, sorry for the business pun, but cash is king, outside of money, that's the thing that most people respond to. And so if that's the best way that we can push back and say, we don't support what the denomination is doing here, and we are not going to support that by pushing back, and I'm going to use Doug, I know you're going to drive me, this is going to drive you nuts, giving 80%, giving 75%, giving 50%. Yes, I know that thing has changed. We're not doing that, but it's what we can relate to. If we're not willing to do that, if we're willing to just support whatever the denomination is doing, I don't think we're doing the church and ourselves justice.
Thanks, Derek. Got time probably for one more comment. If anyone wants to have the parting shot, this is your chance. Are there any online comments, Heather, that have come in, or questions? All right. I wanted to make sure our online people at least have a chance to ask questions. All right, Jason.
For a point of clarification, we're going away from ministry shares. Is there a name for the new system?
Ministry
Requested.
shares reimagined
Okay.
is what it has been called. So no, I don't. If they do rename it, they haven't done so yet. I think they're trying to keep the idea the same. So these used to be called quotas, and then I think they might have even used the term assessments way back when. But ministry shares creates that idea that this is we're partners together, and I don't think that part of it is changing. And so I don't imagine they change the name of it because the purpose is still the same. It's just the way you get to the end number is changing.
And the Senate or the denomination, whichever you prefer, still has a requested amount, which I assume is very similar to the amount they
No,
request for.
so I'm gonna be real
Mr.
fussy
Chair?
with words. It's not a requested amount. It's a suggested starting point.
Starting point?
Meaning
Okay.
they essentially say, here's what you gave last year. Here's what it costs to run. They give you some stuff on what it costs to run the various agencies. And I think the primary thing they have each church look at is, hey, you gave X number of dollars last year. Can you consider this amount or maybe more for the coming year? But it's not a request in that they don't say, we'd like you to give this amount. So I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but I'm doing that because I think that gets at the heart of how they're approaching it.
So the expectation with this new system is that churches continue the current level of support, if not increase.
Right.
And
Well,
I think
that's
that was echoed earlier.
yeah.
Or-
That so it. Right. That
Well, I guess maybe there's a difference in expectations from the denomination versus the congregations. And is that? Yeah. So. Yeah, when we whoever made the decision, I presume it was passed through Synod. Whoever made that decision, were they expecting less money, more money, or the same money
When
at
they
that
made the
level?
switch, you mean?
when they proposed the switch?
I believe, I don't remember what they accounted. Like I don't remember. Yeah, shoot, I can't remember if they were figuring on a decrease or an increase. I think they thought they would see it. I better not, because I honestly don't remember what they were projecting. I can tell you what they've seen, and that is a decline, but the year's not over either, and so sometimes churches give at the end of the year one lump sum. So, do you know, Derek, if yeah, I think that's a yeah. Right. That's a good way to put it. So
I'm just going to repeat that into the microphone.
yes, please do. Go
I
ahead.
believe
Yeah,
what
yeah,
Derek
yeah.
was saying, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the expectation is to basically reverse how the budget is established, that the churches commit to a pledge, and then that becomes the Synod budget, rather than the previous system where the Synod sets the budget and then sets the ministry shares based on that budget. So indirectly, we should have more control based on our pledges.
Yeah. So what was happening previously in previous years was they were expecting, based on ministry share numbers, that they would get a certain dollar amount coming in, and they would be off not just by maybe 1 or 2%, but big significant amounts. And then they would have to do a couple things. Each agency would then have to cut back their budget. They'd have to find places to cut mid-year or 3/4 of the way through the year, and they would then have to look at how to share around some of the money from one agency to another. So maybe Resonate gets, which is our mission agency, they often do fairly well in terms of raising support and getting income. They because lots of churches take extra offerings, so they might come out ahead. Well, then sometimes what they'll do is they'll move some of that money to an agency that gets less money and is further under budget. So that's what they were having to do. With this new system, the idea is, okay, they can get pretty close to an accurate prediction of what the budget will be. We are at 8:30, and so I'm going to close in prayer, and you can continue to converse, and there's even cake, thanks to Derek and Emily, the Gridanis family, for surplus cake. So coffee, cake. It's decaf coffee, if that makes any difference for you. You're welcome to continue the conversation. There is another one of these town halls that will be scheduled for, it's a Monday night in October. Monday what is it, 18th? That sounds right. So the conversation isn't over. We'll continue to have these discussions and try to discern what God would have us do and work through this. But let me close in prayer. Father, thank you for the ways that we can live and work together as a church, to listen to one another, to learn, to discuss, and even to disagree on these issues. All of that's part of the ways that your Spirit leads us through to figuring out and discovering what your will is. This conversation is far from over, but we sense that you've been at work tonight, and we pray that you continue to do so in the coming days and weeks and even months as we have these discussions. Guide us and direct us and be with us on our homeward way. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you, everybody. As you said, you're free to go and help yourself to cake and coffee.